The wreck of this Vietnamese gunboat is incontestable evidence of that invasion. Starting from September 1977, the Vietnamese army launched a series of massive, premeditated and unwarned invasions. The towering crimes of the Vietnamese aggressors aroused immense hatred on the part of our people. People, old and young, were shot to death. Like fascists, they shot our womenfolk after raping them. Their brutality exceeded that of the US imperialist mercenaries.
While the Khmer Rouge fumed with indignation, their own attacks across the Vietnamese border were exceptionally barbaric. Yet despite these provocations, the Vietnamese said nothing for more than a year. They were playing a waiting game. They were probing and testing the Pol Pot regime, trying to force a new border settlement while ignoring the one they'd made with Sihanouk during the war. The Khmer Rouge were easily baited. Their response to intimidation was to launch more belligerent raids. On the border issue, they would never yield. There was nothing at all to negotiate. At the end of 1977, the Vietnamese launched a punishing invasion and then withdrew. But instead of being sobered, the Khmer Rouge made a parade of prisoners and pretended to have won a great historic victory. Now they boasted that every Khmer Rouge fighter would kill 30 Vietnamese. They said they were ready to sacrifice 2 million Kampucheans in order to wipe out all 50 million of their Vietnamese neighbors. The Khmer Rouge were now consumed with paranoia.
Defeated in its military provocations, Vietnam turned to the use of agents to stage abortive coups d'etats on 6 different occasions. POW Tran Van Thuan revealed that the plan of the Communist Party of Vietnam was to set up puppet regimes at all levels of Kampuchea. From these confessions, it is evident that the Vietnamese aim at forcing Kampuchea to join an Indochina federation dominated by Vietnam. Comrade Pol Pot pointed out that we have won initial victory, but our enemies will not be reconciled to defeat. We must be vigilant and be ready at all times to defend our motherland.
In 1978, around the time of this rally, the bloodiest purges of all were being carried out here in the eastern zone of Kampuchea. As the witch hunt for Vietnamese spies became more and more desperate, the Pol Pot regime was destroying itself from within. At least 100,000 were slaughtered because the Khmer Rouge leaders here were accused of being contaminated by the Vietnamese. Just how many died during the 3.5 years of Pol Pot's rule can never be known for sure. But estimates suggest a death toll of at least 700,000 Kampucheans, and perhaps as many as 1 million. As the one great ally and sponsor of the Pol Pot regime, China must have known of these atrocities. After the death of Mao Zedong, the Chinese had denounced and purged their own radicals, known as the Gang of Four. And yet, in the case of Kampuchea, the Chinese were committed to backing the Khmer Rouge to the bitter end. Indeed, as they warned of Vietnam's military preparations, they stepped up their deliveries of aid and war materials to bolster the Khmer Rouge.
There is no contradiction because between the Chinese internal policy and the Chinese external policy, because China mainly takes into account the Soviet danger and the Vietnamese danger. So since the Gang of Four in Cambodia, that is to say Pol Pot and Madame Pol Pot, Ieng Sari and Madame Ieng Sari, and the fifth one is Khieu Saphon, but Khieu Saphon is just a figurehead in the hands of Pol Pot and Ieng Sary. So China has to support them because they can't bleed the Vietnamese. Their army still is strong.
The Vietnamese leaders in Hanoi had proved their military genius and refused to kowtow to China. As a matter of pride and security, they were prepared for a showdown to stake their claims over Kampuchea. They'd already angered China when the Chinese minority living in Vietnam became a target for persecution, and hundreds of thousands were forced to leave as boat people or overland refugees. Now their economy was one of the poorest on earth, but their army was one of the largest. In fact, only the superpowers had more men under arms. As tensions rose with Peking, the Vietnamese began secretly planning for a new military campaign. But first they needed insurance from a superpower ally.
The Vietnamese prepared in their own way to set up a friendly regime in Cambodia. And in doing that, they consulted the Soviets, and they also looked at the possibilities of reactions they would get from other countries, particularly China, if the regime in Cambodia was overthrown. And this is why they consulted the Soviets and then agreed to the Soviet suggestion, which was made much earlier, to sign a treaty of friendship. The Soviets actually suggested to the Vietnamese as early as 1975 that we should sign a treaty of friendship. Vietnamese turned that down. But then in 1978, the Vietnamese approached the Soviets saying, we would like to sign the treaty, because Vietnamese knew that that treaty would buy them an insurance against likely or possible Chinese reaction to what they're going to do in Cambodia. So in November 78, the Vietnamese signed a treaty with the Soviet Union.
In December 1978, the Khmer Rouge launched a fairly small attack into Vietnam, northwest of Ho Chi Minh City in Tay Ninh province, and it was at this point that the Vietnamese hit. They decided that enough was enough. They were going to go for broke. They had neither the political nor the underlying current of a revolution in Kampuchea, and they decided to go for broke. They did this with a tactic known as the Blooming Lotus, which merely is a textbook drive straight down highways. They picked 3 main highways into Kampuchea, where all highways lead to Phnom Penh, and they simply drove down the highways, splitting up the Pol Pot forces as they went. The idea was simply to reach Phnom Penh and into western Kampuchea as quickly as possible, establish as much control of the roads and the strategic areas as possible, as quickly as possible. And this is what they did with the so-called Blooming Lotus. The Pol Pot forces were put into massive disarray. So the original tactic did work. It did establish the command, and it did get the Vietnamese into Phnom Penh, where they could quickly claim victory. It took some 2 weeks to reach Phnom Penh.
When the capital fell on the 7th of January 1979, the Vietnamese had won control of Kampuchea. After 3.5 years of terror, the Pol Pot regime had collapsed. To cap their stunning victory, the Vietnamese had even planned to kidnap Sihanouk from house arrest. But just a day before Phnom Penh was captured, the prince was released by the Khmer Rouge and flown out to China. Pol Pot himself and the leading Khmer Rouge then fled to the jungle only hours in advance of the Vietnamese juggernaut.
It all appears very confused when communists start fighting communists, but I think it's fairly simple here, really. The border fighting merely provided an excuse for something that was bound to occur sooner or later. If there had not been border fighting, it might have had to have been achieved through a coup d'etat in Phnom Penh or an infiltration of Pol Pot's Communist Party. But Vietnamese control of Indochina is a basic tenet.